Hey everyone, welcome to Broadband Deployment News. Back December of last year, 13 senators sent a letter to Chairwoman Rosenworcel of the FCC requesting an extension on when broadband availability and location challenges would be accepted, and basically just saying that they had issues with the FCC maps. So I'm going to look at that as well as the Chairwoman's response in just a second. Be right back. Hey, thanks for joining me. Rick Husey here with Broadband Deployment News. So I thought I'd take a look at this. So again, this letter was sent in December of last year, and this was when the FCC and the NTIA came out and said, okay, here's what we think our timeline is going to look like as far as when we think the next broadband map is going to be ready approximately, and also when the NTIA anticipates on determining what the funds are going to be for each state. So all of this is very important to each state in the country as to how much money they're going to get from this program. So I thought I'd look at this letter and then also at the chairwoman's response, which came out, I think, February 10th, I believe it was. We'll see here in a second. So this is the letter, December 22nd, from the senators, and just a couple of things I want to note in here. So they say, we write to urge the FCC and the National and the NTIA to extend the deadline to submit location and availability challenges to the FCC's broadband maps by at least 60 days or until March 14, 2023. And that was based on something that they came out and said, the FCC came out and said, and maybe the NTIA came out and said that it would be best if you got your challenges in by January 13th so that it'll have the best chance of getting into the next map. So the senators were seeing how many mistakes there were in the fabric and in the initial broadband map, and they were concerned about that, and they wanted to make sure that there was time to do these challenges. They say the significant flaws in the draft maps recently released by the FCC further underline the need for a robust challenge process. And then this was, they talk about some specific items in here. I won't go through because actually the response from Chairman Rosenworcel actually covers some of these things, but they talk about those particular things. Then you can see there's 13 senators, and I put down their party and what state they're with. I was just curious. So, so you've got basically a pretty bipartisan. You've got three Republicans on here out of the 13, but we do have some Republicans on here. So we've got see Cantwell, Washington, Wicker in Mississippi, Lujan in New Mexico, Heinrich in New Mexico, Wyden in Oregon, Casey in Pennsylvania, Michigan, we've got Peters, Warnock, my state, Georgia, Nevada, we've got Rosen, we've got Fisher from Nebraska, Blackburn from Tennessee, Murray from Washington, and Hickenlooper from Colorado. So those are the senators that signed off on this. So as I mentioned, we had a response here, February 10th, from the chairwoman, and it's a long document, but I think it's basically just 13 letters that say the same thing because all the senators sent the same letter to her, but she responded 13 times just to send one to each of their offices, I guess. So I'm just going to look through one letter. I was going to highlight some of the things that she says in here that I think are kind of key. So, so she gives a little background here. I thought I'd go through this as well for anybody that's maybe not familiar with this. A lot of the background, a lot of you may be, but especially if you tune in a lot. But I thought I'd go through some of this. So, since the passage of the Broadband Data Act in March 2020, so what she's saying here, this is prior to the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, prior to the BEAD program. The Congress had already passed some time ago legislation that would say we need better broadband maps because the Congress knew that. So she's saying since that time, the Commission has perpetually worked to implement the requirements of the law and to begin the iterative data collection and challenge process envisioned by the Act through the creation of its Broadband Data Collection Program. So this whole broadband data collection thing, again, was in the works prior to the BEAD program. There was some delay because Congress said they wanted it, and then they didn't fund it, and then finally they funded it, and then the FCC got started, and they picked CostQuest as the vendor to do the data collection fabric, which we'll talk about. But then another company challenged that, so that caused the delay there as well. But finally, they got everything going. Says the BDC is a significant departure from the Commission's previous Form 477 process used for identifying the state of broadband deployment. The FCC, or the Form 477 process, which was used by the agency in various formats for decades, collected data only at the census block level. So we knew this was a problem. And specifically, as she mentions here, If there was a single subscriber in the census block, the agency assumed service was available throughout. So you could have a census block and a service provider could say, yeah, we provide service at this address and this is the highest speed that we provide in that census block at this address. And it could mean that other addresses in that census block got lower speeds or had no service at all. So the FCC saw that and said, well, this whole census block we'll call covered, even when we knew that was not the case. As a result, the 477 process systematically overstated the presence of broadband, particularly in rural areas. In addition, this process lacked a mechanism to verify that data based on the on-the-ground experience of consumers and other stakeholders. In other words, there was no way to challenge that data. It was just whatever the ISPs said. And again, it was not granular enough to show what was broadband at each address. She says, this is no longer the case. As required by the Broadband Data Act, the Commission has built an entirely new data collection system for investigating, validating, and aggregating provider data for download and publication on the National Broadband Map. This system is also designed to incorporate data submitted by individual consumers and by state and tribal governments and other stakeholders challenging a provider's availability submission at particular locations. So now it's per location and it can be challenged. In addition, the Broadband Data Act required the Commission to develop the Broadband Serviceable Location Fabric, or called the Fabric. The Fabric is a common data set of all broadband serviceable locations in the United States where mass market fixed broadband internet access service is available or could be installed. So this is meant to show every broadband serviceable location, whether there's broadband there or not. So it's not saying broadband is here and somebody has it, and broadband is here and somebody doesn't have it. It's basically broadband should be here. It doesn't really matter whether broadband is there, is service there or not. It's just saying these addresses should have broadband. It's not looking at who has broadband, what the speeds are. That's not what the Fabric is. The Fabric dataset supports location-by-location reporting of available fixed broadband services by internet service providers. In other words, the Fabric is the underlying fabric or data set. And then on top of that is where we upload the service, the actual availability data. To be clear, the Fabric itself is not a map. It is an evolving database of all BSLs, or broadband serviceable locations, nationwide that is used in the production of the map when combined with information from service providers and data from the challenge process. So they created their Fabric, and then the first filing window was approximately the end of June through September 1st, I think it was, of last year, where internet service providers were then on top of that Fabric of all of these addresses that were supposed to have broadband. Each service provider uploaded information as to whether they serve that location, and then the maximum advertised speed, whether the latency is 100 or under 100 milliseconds round trip, and a few other things on there that they needed to load. On June 23rd, 2022, the initial production version of the Fabric was submitted, and again, at the end of June through September is when the ISPs finished their filing, and that was on September 1st, 2022. And I know that there are probably some ISPs that did not complete their filing because that was brand new for them, and it was difficult because they had to match location IDs in the Fabric with their own addresses, and that was not easy to do, to match those things. So I know there are probably some ISPs that didn't get their filing in. I also know there are some ISPs that got it in that had things wrong. In fact, we have a customer that, they get some services from us. We don't do the broadband map stuff, but they get some services from us. And I know for a fact that they missed, if you looked at the map, they missed lots of locations. They did something wrong. And when I reached out to them, they said, yeah, we did. And they said, quote, they were furiously working on getting that up to date to get the Fabric correct, and I should say the broadband map correct. So they're now in the second round, making sure that they get all of their serviceable addresses where they can provide service updated. It says November 18th, 2022 is when the pre-production draft of the new National Broadband Map depicting broadband availability is released. As of June 30th, 2022, so that's kind of key. So the map came out in November, but the data on the map was as of June 30th. That was the last day that ISPs were completing their filings. So it wasn't up until November 18th. It was as of June 30th. 2,500 facilities-based providers submitted that, and broadband internet access services. So that's what they submitted. So, that date, January or June 30th, was for that map. This next map is supposed to be as of December, the end of December of 2022. Now, I suppose there could be some changes that the FCC puts in there based on various things. But really, the way it's supposed to work is that the internet service providers, as they're now, right now, basically the end of, the beginning of January through March 1st is this current filing window. So they are supposed to be putting in their broadband availability data as of the end of 2022, December 31st, 2022 is the date that they're supposed to put. So if they've not yet deployed broadband and they're doing it right now, that's not supposed to be something that they put in as covered. So again, there's going to be a bit of a gap in there as to some broadband that's being deployed even now on that. However, as you acknowledge, the Broadband Data Act envisions the Commission's BDC efforts to be an iterative process through which these maps evolve as the facts on the ground change and incorporates improvements and refinements that are a result of the ongoing challenge in crowdsourced processes. Our release of the pre-production draft of the new National Broadband Map on November 18th kicked off the opportunity for challengers to dispute the accuracy of the availability data. And that's true. So actually, you could do bulk challenges of the fabric prior to that. That was, I think, in mid-September, you could start doing bulk challenges of the fabric, which would be locations only, not broadband availability, but whether a particular structure should have broadband. Those challenges were ongoing during that time. And then mid-November, November 18th, is when they opened up the broadband map. And at that point, consumers could go to the map, look up their address, see what it said they were supposed to have, and they could challenge that on their own. And then also bulk challenges could be done. I want to clarify that the January 13th, 2023 date that the senators mentioned in their letter was not a deadline because the Commission continues to accept and resolve location and availability challenges so they may be included in future iterations of the map. The Commission rules make clear that the agency will accept challenges to the fabric and availability data on a rolling basis at any time. So, that's a little bit vague because they have to eventually put a stake in the ground so that they can create the new map. And I think that was what they were saying with the January 13th date was, for one thing, internet service providers are going to be putting in their broadband availability data from early January through March 1st. So, even those things are changing as we go here. So at some point, I don't know how much of the challenges are going to be in the map. Hopefully the FCC will look at those, and especially big, significant changes. Like if they find if there's a challenge that, there's thousands of homes that are missing, or there's a whole neighborhood here where it says they get gig service and they don't even have DSL. They can't get 25 by 3. Those kinds of things need to obviously be looked at. And I think the FCC is going to tackle those as we go and would make exceptions in those cases. That's just my guess. Let's see. But I think the point there is that this is an ongoing process. This is something twice a year. First off, there'll be new locations that are added to the fabric just by the fact that there will be new places popping up that need broadband. And maybe there'll be some errors fixed in here and there, but eventually I think all the errors will be fixed. And then it's just going to be basically additions and deletions as to homes are added, or maybe places are torn down, I guess, but it's mostly going to be added homes at that point. And then, of course, there'll be changes to the availability data because there'll be new internet service providers coming into areas, and there'll be internet service providers upgrading their service. So maybe today they say they can't do 25 by 3, but then they come in and they rip out their DSL and put in fiber, and suddenly they can do, gig service. So those kinds of changes will be ongoing, and that will be an ongoing change in the map, although you'll only see it twice a year. So, when the map will come out twice a year, the internet service providers, just prior to that, a couple months before that, will be uploading their updated data. There'll be fabric changes during those times, and the maps will be ongoing, being improved or made to reflect what the actual situation is. The NTIA continues to target June 30th as the date by which it will allocate each state and territory's funding. And that's why this is important, because the BEAD funding, $42.45 billion, each state gets $100 million, but then states that have the most number of unserved locations that are under 25 by 3 will get the more share, basically, based on the total number of unserved locations throughout the country. So that's why everybody's trying to make sure that these maps are correct as far as how many locations there are, and then how many of those locations in a state are served. January 13, 2023 was identified as the target date by which availability challenges had the best opportunity to be fully addressed and incorporated into the map. And that's also because of the fact that there's a challenge process, and that takes some time. And she goes through that here in a minute, I think. However, the Commission stands ready to continue to work with all stakeholders to receive feedback and continue to improve our map over time. Then it talks about the fabric here. As noted above, the fabric is an evolving data set of all BSLs in the United States, and substantial improvements have been made to it since its first pre-production release. So when the first fabric came out, people were freaking out. And it's like, oh my gosh, there's all these missing locations. But you have to understand the difficulty in creating this fabric that has to look at every structure in the United States and then determine whether they're supposed to be broadband or not. It is the product of integrating a wide range of data sources, including address records, information about parcel boundaries, tax assessment records, imagery and building footprint data, census data, land use records, and geospatial road and street data. That's a lot of stuff to put together. In fact, to build the fabric, more than 200 data attributes are assessed using artificial intelligence and machine learning to identify the precise geocoordinates of each BSL, again, broadband serviceable location, included in the dataset. The first version of the fabric contained more than 113.2 million BSLs. So a lot of that artificial intelligence, what that was doing was, you need to try to precisely put a dot on the structure that's supposed to have broadband. So in most cases, that's not that difficult. So you've got neighborhoods, where you've got single-family homes that are not connected, and it's pretty easy to mark those. But you might have rural areas where you've got farms and you've got garages and you've got this and that. So the people at CostQuest actually, they ran through this and then they tried to teach the program, okay, let's look at different roof lines and different parcels and try to teach the program where there's supposed to be broadband on these other kinds of areas. So you had to use AI to do that because, again, you got 113 million of these. You can't go through individual on those. So that was kind of the start of that. She says, I personally reached out to broadband leaders. She talks about how she talked to everybody in the various states. The FCC opened a process on September 12th, 2022, and that was prior to the map coming out, for governmental entities, internet service providers, and other entities to begin submitting challenges for multiple broadband serviceable locations. In other words, bulk fabric challenges. She talks about a lot of the things that they provided, webinars, workshops, FAQs. Governmental entities, including 20 states, submitted 1.11 million individual challenges to the version 1 of the fabric data that were processed in anticipation of preparation of version 2 of the fabric. So in other words, they looked at version 1 of the fabric, and then they were looking at that, and all these challenges were coming in. The first broadband map came out based on version 1 of the fabric, but they were continuing to look at the challenges on the first fabric in anticipation of the next fabric. So that didn't affect the first broadband map, but it's going to affect, it affected the second broadband fabric, which right now internet service providers are using to upload their availability data, and also that that government entities and other stakeholders were able to provide additional challenges to. These challenges were predominantly challenges to add missing locations, because this was the fabric we're talking about here, but included challenges to correct information associated with existing locations as well. Many of these challenges require identifying differences in the data collection practices used by governmental entities and providers and those required for the BDC. In other words, in many cases, we have the same data, but in different format, or may require slight latitude and longitude adjustments to the BSLs. To put these challenges in context, it's important to note that they sought corrections for records corresponding to less than 1% of the total number of locations identified in version 1 of the fabric. So in other words, it was over 99% correct. Again, this was a monumental undertaking to create this fabric, so that's pretty good. Of these 1.11 million challenges, more than half were for locations that were either already included in version 1 of the fabric or that CostQuest had independently identified through its own efforts. So again, the fabric included location IDs. You could look at an address, but there was a location ID. So as people were trying to do these challenges, there may have been some differences in the addresses, trying to match the addresses when you have a format of, road versus RD or circle versus CR on the address or something like that. Those kinds of things are hard to match up with text matching. So there's various reasons that both those that were doing the fabric challenges and then internet service providers, when they were doing their availability data, they had to work with that same fabric and try to match their addresses where they could provide service with the addresses in the fabric and make sure that they're using the right location ID. That was all very difficult, especially in that first round when they were first doing that. So that's part of that problem there. So we're saying basically that a lot of these challenges were just, slight differences in the way things were listed. They also mentioned that, again, CostQuest, this was the vendor that created the fabric, had independently identified through its own efforts a lot of these things. Successful location challenges from state governments resulted in approximately 122,000 new locations being added, or slightly more than 0.1% of the number of locations included in the first version. Version 2 of the fabric includes 1.04 million more locations than the version currently shown on the National Broadband Map. So again, that's important to know that if you're looking at the current National Broadband Map and you don't see a location, well, there's over a million, barely over a million, but over a million of these addresses that are not on the map because it's on version 2 of the fabric, which will be the next map that comes out. These additional locations are primarily the result of CostQuest's ongoing efforts to update and improve the fabric by refining the models and processes for creating the fabric and using updated and improved input data sources such as new and more granular parcel data. So looks like they've got access to new, better data. Version 2 also incorporates millions of adjustments to the data associated with locations that were already included in version 1 of the fabric, including, for example, changes to address fields, unit counts, secondary addresses, BSL status, building and land use codes, etc. So again, that's currently in the hands of the internet service providers to use that new fabric to upload their availability data. Meaningful changes have been made to the fabric as a result of these efforts, for example, and now she goes through some of the examples that were brought up in the senator's letters. For example, in Mineral County, Nevada, the number of BSLs increased 17.9% from version 1. We believe version 2 of the dataset, which reflects changes like these, will address most, if not all, of the outstanding concerns. On top of that, any remaining issues will continue to be addressed through our continued efforts to improve and refine the data in future versions. As noted above, the Commission will accept location challenges from all stakeholders at any time on a rolling basis. But fabric data adjustments from the vendor and challenge process are only pushed through to the official National Broadband Map twice a year after providers have reported their availability data based on the revisions. And again, that window is ongoing right now, or going on right now, I should say, and that will end March 1st. So at that point, we'll have version 2 of the fabric, and we'll have all of the internet service providers that have said where they provide service on those BSLs on that fabric. And hopefully as correct as possible. And hopefully internet service providers have been reading about the fact that the FCC is now, and we'll see about this in a minute, looking at service providers that maybe have put wrong information in there. And when I say wrong information, I think maybe information that makes it look like they're providing broadband. This is what I mean, is that makes it look like they're providing service of at least 25 by 3 when they don't. Okay, now it could be a mistake, it could be an honest mistake, could be that we know there's places where it's not an honest mistake. There's one particular provider that was caught saying that, oh yeah, we did that because we're going to be putting in a lot of investment, or have put in a lot of investment in doing XGS ponds. So even though we said you could get gig service, you really can't even get 25 by 3. So that's the kind of thing that that's going to be a problem for some internet service providers. So hopefully they're hearing about the fact that this is going to be looked at, and making sure that they get things as correct as possible. Continually updating the National Broadband Map to reflect changes to the fabric would create anomalies in the data, because the map would contain locations for which providers have not had an opportunity to report availability, causing the maps to be less useful as a depiction of availability on the as-of date. So again, there's a little bit of a lag there. It's as of a certain date. In this case, as of December 31st, 2022 is when this next broadband map is going to be reflective of, basically as of 2022, even though it's coming out probably in May, mid-May, late May, sometime around then, I think. We also have acknowledged that there were a few discrete instances where these data in version 1 of the fabric did not meet our expectations. The known instances correspond to areas in the United States where the underlying data sets used to create the fabric, parcel data, tax assessor data, high-resolution imagery data, were either outdated or simply not available. CostQuest invested significant resources since the release of the first version of the fabric to undertake manual review above and beyond the baseline methodology to identify additional BSLs in these areas. So CostQuest has been trying to improve this fabric, including getting better parcel data. I understand that researchers found that a significant number of residences and businesses in a town on tribal lands were missing entirely from the new map. Tribal lands within the continental United States have seen significant increases in the number of BSLs between version 1 and version 2 of the fabric. So that has probably been addressed, hopefully significantly. In Mississippi, the state broadband office called attention to addresses missing in high growth areas of the state, and I understand that there are particularly concerns with DeSoto and Madison counties. After careful review and analysis in DeSoto County, we added 3,039 BSLs, a 4.5% increase in version 2, and in Madison County, there was a slight drop in the number of BSLs, 116 fewer in version 2 than in version 1, including the addition of 548 new BSLs offset by the removal of 664 locations that were not BSLs. So there were some locations marked as serviceable that were not supposed to be. Again, that could be a barn where it was just a structure that looked like it was supposed to have broadband and it's not. And then, so basically that provided like a net decrease, but there were some corrections in the fabric there. In New Mexico, they mentioned Cochiti, New Mexico had an increase of 180 BSLs, Sandoval County, an increase of 830, Shiprock increased by 2,394, San Juan County, New Mexico, they added 8,568. Overall, the state of New Mexico gained 20,456 BSLs from version 1 to version 2. So as I had been saying, I think all along, when I was seeing states challenge these thousands of locations that were not there, I was basically saying, there's probably somebody that's, the state's going to challenge it, it will get fixed. And even if the state sees that those locations are missing, it's very possible that the internet service provider that is servicing that area has already challenged that as well. So, again, you've got ISPs and states and other stakeholders that are all kind of trying to challenge this stuff at the same time. And it may be that nobody knows what the other one's doing. So we've got several people putting in the same challenges. Nebraska, we had Arthur, Nebraska, the county seat of Arthur County, increased by 153 BSLs. Arthur County increased from 192 BSLs in version 1 to 345 BSLs in version 2. And then she talks about the fixed availability data. So this is not the fabric. This is the actual availability data that the internet service providers are overlaying on top of the fabric. And it's supposed to be available if the provider could and is willing to connect that location to service within 10 business days. So that's the kind of thing where the internet service provider provides service there. It's basically already running to the curb. It's not a long driveway situation where they have to charge somebody extra for it and it's going to take, 3 weeks to get it installed. It's basically supposed to be like within a standard install of 10 business days that the service is already there. If the customer calls, they can get it. They don't have to say, they have to argue with the person. It's like, well, we'll put it in, but you got to pay $1,000. There's none of that. That's not available. Substantially more precise. She mentions it's substantially more precise than the one that preceded it from Form 477. So the availability data is much more precise, obviously, than it was before. We knew this. And that information can be challenged using either the map interface or via bulk availability challenge. So that's another benefit. And that was not available in the Form 477. You could not do that, challenge that. Your letter also indicates that you have heard of inaccuracies in the availability data filed in the map in some areas. I anticipate that over time, the challenge process will serve to correct many of the inaccuracies in the current iteration of the map. Nevertheless, I plan on using every tool at the Commission's disposal to correct the map and appreciate you highlighting areas where you believe widespread inaccuracies may exist. This includes enforcement action, yes, when providers do not comply with our rules when they file availability data, and to this end, we already have enforcement investigation that is ongoing. So again, that should be a signal to any internet service provider that is currently uploading their availability data that they need to be very careful about that, and certainly not purposely misstate it. But you don't want to mistake it you don't want to be mistaken on that for any reason, because again, this could impact the money that the state gets. And even if you do it by accident, if it's something pretty massive, like a whole, thousands of homes that you say you provide service to and you don't, I think the FCC is not going to look kindly on that. Your letter notes that Microsoft's data show that under 20% of the population in Stevens County, Washington, are actually using the internet at broadband speeds. So they're saying Microsoft says only 20% are using the internet at broadband speeds. Both the Microsoft Digital Equity tool and the FCC's draft map indicate that 100% of Stevens County has broadband availability at speeds of 25.3 or greater. The 20% metric cited refers to the percentage of the population that uses the internet at broadband speeds. So I think she's saying there that data that you're looking at says people are using that, but they may not have internet. They might not have a plan that is, even if there's a plan that's higher than 25 by 3, maybe they don't subscribe to it, that kind of thing. The difference may indicate a lack of adoption or affordability of broadband services in addition to availability. The same Microsoft Digital Equity tool indicates that over 25% of households in the county do not subscribe to broadband of any type, that over 26% do not own a laptop or desktop computer. So that could have an indication. If they're looking at who, based on this, is who is getting broadband speeds, but yet a lot of the population doesn't even have broadband, or they can't afford the higher packages, it could be part of that. Now, there could be, again, there's going to be situations in the country where internet service providers that are on the cusp of unserved or underserved are overstating what they have. It could be a DSL provider that in the past, in a census block, said, yeah, we offer 25 by 3 here. And maybe they did or do, and it's that house that's the closest to their central office that on DSL they can get a little better than 25 by 3. But then the rest of the houses in that census block, as you go further out, they can pick anywhere in that census block. So as you go further out, that could be houses that didn't get that. So hopefully they're not doing that. They're supposed to look at the speed available that somebody can get. Now, it is the maximum advertised speed, and that's heartburn for a lot of people. Especially where it's really critical is when you, again, on the cusp of unserved. If a provider says, yeah, we provide 25 by 3, but 90% of the population of that area can't get anywhere near that, maybe they're getting 10 or something like that, then that's a problem. So these things are serious situations that need to be looked at. And the FCC, I'm sure, as these challenges come in from communities that say, this whole area, they're saying they can get 25 by 3 and they can't, the FCC is going to look at that. And it's not going to be good for the internet service provider that is advertising that somebody can get 25 by 3 and then specifically putting it on the broadband data map, and it's not close to being true. That's going to be a problem. But there are situations like that need to be looked at. And I would think the same for people that are close to 100 by 20, because again, that's the cutoff for underserved. And the internet service providers that get BEAD funds, or anybody that's going to get BEAD funds, the subgrantees, need to address unserved first. That's anything less than 25 by 3. And then they can address underserved. That's less than 100 by 20, more than 25 by 3. So that's the next thing. So underserved is important as well. So we need to make sure that anything under 100 by 20 is very accurate as far as what the speed that's available actually is, what can be gotten, so to speak. Moreover, there are significant differences in data sources used to compile the two sets. Microsoft appears to include Form 477 data, census data, and other customer surveys, while the Commission's new maps are based on granular location by location availability data reported by providers based on fabric points. It may also be worth noting that the map data show all broadband technologies that were reported to the Commission, when the map data are filtered to show only the speeds and technology that the NTIA identified as reliable broadband services in its BEAD notice of funding opportunity. In other words, wired or licensed fixed wireless services. The map indicates that roughly 38% of locations are served by such services with speeds of 25 by 3 or greater in Stevens County. So in other words, on the broadband map, it's unfortunate the way they did it. When you first open the broadband map, it looks like everything is served because it includes satellite and includes any kind of fixed wireless, including unlicensed spectrum. So therefore, you could have an unlicensed wireless spectrum or satellite. You certainly have, if you've got Starlink is over most of the country, if not over the whole country, they could be reporting, 100 by 10 or something like that, whatever they may be reporting in different areas. That's going to show up as served, but it's not considered reliable broadband service as far as the BEAD NOFO goes, as she mentions here, which means that won't count. So those areas, if you've got satellite or unlicensed spectrum, that doesn't count towards whether that area is served. If you've got fixed wireless licensed, and I believe it's fixed wireless licensed and unlicensed combinations. If you've got an area that has both, for some reason they consider that reliable broadband service if you have both. Or wired service, and that could be any kind of wired service. That could even include DSL, I believe. Yeah, I think it's even DSL, as long as it's over 25 by 3, which is hard to do. But any kind of wired service, and then wireline service, or again, fixed wireless licensed, and I believe maybe even licensed and unlicensed combo. That would be reliable broadband service. But if it's not one of those, as she says, there are filters on the map where you can take that stuff off, and that changes then what you see as being served. Let's see here. Similarly, in Granger County, Tennessee, the Microsoft Digital Equity tool relies on older FCC Form 477 data as well as a range of other data sources to measure digital equity and broadband access more generally. comparison of the two tools may be useful, but in light of these differences, they are unlikely to yield a similar result. And she gives some information on the challenge process here. Consistent with the Broadband Data Act, any individual may file a fabric or availability challenge directly through the National Broadband Map interface. Service providers, governments, and other entities may file challenges in bulk by uploading data files into the BDC system. So if somebody has to have access to the fabric, that would be like an internet service provider or a government or somebody that already has access to the fabric. But consumers can do it on the map as well as anybody else can do it on the map. Challenges will be sent to the relevant provider for response. So this shows the response situation here. So once the challenge is done, now this is going to be, this response is really going to be more about location challenges, I believe, on the map, as opposed to availability challenges. Challenges will be sent to the relevant provider for response, and the provider will have 60 days to review and either concede the challenge, in which case they must remove that location from their availability data within 30 days, or dispute it. If a provider disputes a challenge, the provider must provide evidence in the BD system and to the challenger to rebut the challenge. The provider and challenger then have 60 days to attempt to resolve the challenge. If the provider and challenger cannot resolve the challenge, the commission will adjudicate the challenge based on the evidence. So you notice it's talking about locations here and not speed. So I think if a consumer says, hey, you say I can get over 25 by 3, but I'm doing a speed test and I can't, they can challenge that, and it does get sent to the provider, but I don't think the provider has to respond to that like they would, let's say, a location challenge like this. If a provider loses a challenge, did I say this? The provider and challenger then have 60 days to attempt to resolve the challenge. If the provider and challenger cannot resolve the challenge, the commission will adjudicate the challenge based on the evidence. If a provider loses a challenge, it must revise its data consistent with the decision within 30 days, and the commission will update the map accordingly. Despite these timelines, we expect that many challenges will be resolved more quickly, especially if providers respond promptly to challenges or are able to mediate challenges in advance of adjudication. Now, whether they want to respond promptly or not is a question, because they're trying to protect their territories and prevent other people from getting federal funds to overbuild them, even if they're planning on improving the service there. So hopefully they will respond quickly, but they have a deadline anyway, in any event. So there you go. So that's a letter from the chairwoman. So I think she covers a lot of the issues, and I think she, in this, kind of confirms a lot of what I was thinking, which is that first broadband fabric we knew was going to have lots of issues, difficult to do, lots of data that you had to bring together. There were significant challenges that were made. Those were not necessarily were not reflected in the first map, and maybe even not reflected in the second fabric, depending on when those challenges were finished, because they had to get the second fabric ready. So there could have been challenges going on even prior to that. So this next fabric is going to have broadband availability data as of December, and then it's got all of the challenge data. And then there will be, I'm again expecting that the FCC will make some exceptions on areas where you've got significant mistakes, whether that's significant, there's still significant location mistakes. I don't necessarily expect a lot of those. Or if there are, obviously areas that say they're supposed to be getting broadband service that would make them served or underserved, but they're not. I said that backwards. So if there are areas that look like they're served, but they're not, and it's significant that they're looking into that, they're going to be, assuming, fining service providers if it looks like they're doing that on purpose. And then hopefully also making sure that those areas are corrected, because again, there's this challenge process going on. So even though they said try to get your challenges in by January 13th, I'm sure they're still accepting these significant challenges, and they're going to look at those in order to be able to make sure that we get as good as possible a broadband map in like I say, May or so, that reflects as much truth on the ground as possible. And I'm hoping that map, that the number of, and the fabric basically in the map, that the number of inaccuracies in that are going to be so small that's not really going to impact the amount of money that each state gets. So that's the first thing, is that hopefully, all of these huge thousands of addresses will be corrected, and any of these major issues with, does this area really have broadband service or not, that those significant things will be taken care of. But then finally, even though this determines how much money each state will get, it doesn't necessarily determine whether the state can deploy broadband there, because if the state later can challenge, there can be challenges to state maps after the fact. So a state will get allocated a certain amount of money, and then they will determine where that money goes. And if they see that, you know what, the FCC broadband map still is saying that this area is served, but we know it's not, then they can go ahead and challenge that, and they can go ahead and submit to have broadband funds for that area. So it might be one of these situations where maybe it says there's fixed wireless there, and that it's, you know, it's just an area that's covered, but it doesn't actually have that kind of service. It could be T-Mobile that said they covered it, and then suddenly they have so many customers there that signed up that they can't sign anybody else up. So if they can't sign anybody else up, well, then a new person there can't get broadband, then that's not really covered. So there could be these kinds of areas where the state could then say, you know what, we're going to go ahead and allocate funds to this area. They can make the case to the NTIA as to why they're doing that, and then that area can be provided those funds, even though on the broadband map it shows it's served. So there's still extra time. And a lot of this is all going to be taking place this year and early into next year, because we won't be seeing the funds until sometime early next year, probably, because the states have got to, once they find out how much they get, they've got to get their plan in to the NTIA. They've got to get the challenges all taken care of. The NTIA's got to get back to the states, those kinds of things. So it's going to be a while before all this happens. Thanks for joining me. Hopefully this was helpful. Sorry it was so long, but I thought it was very interesting to read through her response, and just, you know, I think it should put at ease some of the concerns from these senators and others that they have about the maps. We know they're not going to be perfect, even when they come out in May, but I think they're going to be way better. The map is going to be way better, and the fabric is going to be way better than it was from the first fabric and from the first broadband map. I think that will be pretty obvious once it comes out. Hope I'm right. Thanks for joining me. If this was interesting or helpful, if you give me a like on the video, I'd appreciate that. I always like that. And if you're not subscribed, click the subscribe button, click the bell to be notified when I'm live, and I will talk to you next time on Broadband Deployment News. Take care.